Was Jesus black? That's one of the most controversial questions in history. Tonight, we're not looking at paintings or traditions, we're going to look at the text itself.
Was Jesus African? Did Jesus have black skin? What did Jesus actually look like? Why does every painting of Jesus show a white man when he was born in the Middle East? These are the questions 40 million people type into Google every single year, and the answers are sitting in the Bible that most of those people have owned their entire lives without anyone pointing them to the specific verses that answer the question directly. So here's the direct answer before we go anywhere else. Jesus was a first century Judean man, born in Bethlehem, raised in Galilee, spent his first years as a refugee in Egypt, and his physical description as recorded in the New Testament describes bronze-colored skin and wool-textured hair. His maternal lineage runs through women with documented African connections. His earliest years were spent on African soil. The genetic population he descended from was a Near Eastern people with dark complexions who looked nothing like the blonde-haired, blue-eyed figure that 600 years of European painting installed in the global Christian imagination. And if you stay with this video, we are going to go through every piece of that evidence, from the biblical text to the genetic record to the art history to the theology, until the picture you have been carrying of Jesus your entire life has been permanently replaced with the one the people who actually knew him would have recognized. Why do people think Jesus was white? That is the question underneath the question, and it has a specific answer with a specific timestamp. The image of Jesus as a pale, long-haired, blue-eyed, Anglo-Saxon featured man was substantially codified in Western culture in the 6th century, when the Byzantine Emperor Justinian commissioned the mosaic portrait of Jesus at the Church of San Vitale in Ravenna, depicting a beardless, European featured young man. It was then dramatically amplified in the Renaissance, when artists like Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, Raphael, and hundreds of other European painters depicted Jesus in their own cultural image, giving him Italian features, Northern European coloring, and the aesthetic conventions of European idealized portraiture. The image that dominated from the 19th century onward, the long-haired, auburn-bearded, light-skinned, contemplative figure, was created primarily by the Warner Sallman painting called Head of Christ, completed in 1940 by a white American artist from Chicago. That painting was reproduced over 500 million times and distributed globally, embedding itself in churches, homes, and Sunday school classrooms across every continent. The most widely distributed image of Jesus in human history was made by a white man in Illinois in 1940, and it looks like a white man from Illinois. That is not theology. That is marketing. And it is the specific piece of marketing that needs to be dismantled tonight before the actual biblical evidence can be seen clearly. What does the Bible actually say about what Jesus looked like? This is the question most people have never been properly answered, and the answer comes from two primary sources. The first is the prophet Isaiah, whose description in chapter 53 is considered by Christian tradition to be a prophetic portrait of the Messiah. Isaiah 53:2 says, "He had no form or majesty that we should look at him, and no beauty that we should desire him. He grew up before him like a young plant, and like a root out of dry ground." This is describing a man with no striking or exceptional physical appearance by the standards of the culture he lived in. He did not look like a king. He did not have the imposing physical presence of a warrior or noble. He looked ordinary. He looked like the people around him, and the people around him, as we are going to establish in careful detail, were dark-complexioned Semitic people of the ancient Near East who had been living in a region with continuous African contact for their entire history as a people. Isaiah's description is not a racial description, but it is a description that definitively rules out the towering, luminous, otherworldly European figure that painting has given us. He looked ordinary. He looked like everybody else. Everybody else in first century Judea did not look like a European. The second biblical description is in the Revelation of John, chapter 1, verses 13 through 15. And this is the passage that the History Channel, scholars, and theologians all cite as the closest thing to a physical description of the risen Jesus in the New Testament. John writes that he saw one like the Son of Man, clothed in a long robe with a golden sash. The hairs of his head were white, like white wool, like snow. His eyes were like a flame of fire. His feet were like burnished bronze, refined in a furnace. Now this is an apocalyptic vision, which means some of its imagery is symbolic and not intended as photographic description. The white hair, for instance, is almost certainly symbolic of divine wisdom and antiquity, rather than literal hair color, parallel to the Ancient of Days description in Daniel 7 that we discussed in an earlier video in this series. But the feet like burnished bronze refined in a furnace is a color description, not a symbolic one, because fire and refinement are the mechanism and the bronze color is the result. And what the History Channel noted, or biblical scholars including Mark Goodacre of Duke University have noted, and what the plain reading of the text produces, is that burnished bronze refined in a furnace is a dark brown to dark reddish brown color. Not pale, not olive, deep brown. And the wool-like texture of the hair, as we have established in the Jehovah video earlier in this series, is a specific texture description, not simply a color comparison, because snow was available as a color comparison and was used for something else in the same verse. Wool describes the texture. Bronze describes the color. John of Patmos described a dark-complexioned man with wool-textured hair, and then the church spent 1,500 years painting something completely different over his description. What did first century Judeans actually look like? This is the question that anchors everything else, because Jesus was born into a specific population in a specific geographic region at a specific moment in history. And that population has a documented phenotypic profile that modern science can access through multiple lines of evidence. The Judeans of the first century were a Semitic people whose ancestors had spent 400 years in Egypt before the Exodus, whose patriarchs had come from Mesopotamia, and who had lived for centuries in the land of Canaan in continuous contact with the Phoenicians, the Egyptians, the Cushites, and the Arabian populations of the Red Sea corridor. They were not a racially isolated population. They were a Near Eastern people at the intersection of Africa and Asia, which is exactly the genetic and phenotypic profile that the ancient world described for them. No ancient writer, Greek, Roman, or Egyptian, ever described Judeans as pale. No ancient description of Jewish people from the first century contains language that maps on the light European complexion. The Roman representations of captive Judeans on the Arch of Titus, built in 82 AD to commemorate the destruction of Jerusalem, show figures who are clearly Semitic, dark-featured, and bearing no resemblance to Northern European phenotype. A 2001 study by forensic anthropologist Richard Neve, commissioned by the BBC and published in Popular Mechanics, used 3 first-century Judean skulls found near Jerusalem to reconstruct what a typical Galilean man of Jesus' era and region would have looked like. The reconstruction showed a dark-skinned, dark-eyed, short-haired, broad-featured man who looked dramatically different from any European representation of Jesus. The BBC published it. Popular Mechanics published it. It has been cited by historians across the subsequent decades, and it looks nothing like any painting of Jesus you have ever seen in a church. Why did Jesus go to Egypt, and what does that mean for his identity? Matthew chapter 2, verses 13 through 15 is one of the most theologically loaded passages in the New Testament, and one of the most consistently glossed over in popular Christian teaching. After the wise men have visited and warned Joseph in a dream, the angel of the Lord appears to Joseph and says, "Rise, take the child and his mother, and flee to Egypt, and remain there until I tell you." And Joseph rose and took the child and his mother by night, and departed to Egypt, and remained there until the death of Herod. Then Matthew quotes Hosea 11:1, "Out of Egypt I called my son." Jesus grew up in Africa, not for a moment, not for a brief stopover. He fled there as an infant, remained there for the years of Herod's reign, and returned to Judea only after Herod's death. The scholars at the Biblical Archaeology Society have explicitly noted that Jesus' earliest years were spent as a refugee in a foreign land. That foreign land was Africa. The child Jesus played in African streets, breathed African air, and was sheltered and raised in an African environment during the years that modern developmental psychology identifies as the most formative period of human cognitive and personal development. Matthew's use of the Hosea quotation, "Out of Egypt I called my son," is deliberately connecting the life of Jesus to the Exodus narrative, identifying Jesus with Israel itself, which came out of Africa. Jesus came out of Africa. That is not a rhetorical flourish. That is what the text says. Now let's talk about his genealogy, because the lineage of Jesus, as recorded in both Matthew and Luke, contains African connections that are direct and documented. Matthew chapter 1 gives a genealogy of Jesus through his legal father Joseph. That genealogy includes 4 women, which is unusual because ancient genealogies typically listed only men, suggesting Matthew includes these women deliberately for theological reasons. Those 4 women are Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, and Bathsheba. We have discussed some of these women in previous videos in this series. Rahab was a Canaanite woman from Jericho, whose people the Hebrew Bible itself associates with the Hamitic lineage, the peoples of Canaan, who are connected to Africa through the Table of Nations in Genesis 10. Ruth was a Moabite woman from a people of the Transjordan with continuous contact with the African trade corridor. Bathsheba, as we discussed in the Solomon video, carries a name whose etymology connects to the land of Sheba, and her first husband Uriah was a Hittite, a non-Israelite Near Eastern man. Tamar was a Canaanite woman who conceived by Judah, Jacob's son, in a story that is not a flattering account of the patriarchal family's racial purity. The women in the genealogy of Jesus, the women Matthew specifically chose to highlight, are all foreign women. All women with connections outside the mainstream Israelite ethnic group. All women whose presence in the lineage demonstrates that the ancestry of Jesus was never ethnically pure or exclusively Israelite. It was always mixed, always diverse, always carrying the genetic and cultural input of the broader ancient Near Eastern and African adjacent world. Luke's genealogy, which traces Jesus' lineage through Mary rather than Joseph, according to most scholars, goes back even further, all the way to Adam. We have established in the Adam and Eve video in this series that Adam was made from African soil and was therefore dark complexioned. Luke's genealogy is tracing the fully human lineage of Jesus back to its origin, and that origin is African. The theological point Luke is making is that Jesus is the second Adam, the renewal of humanity from its root. And the root of humanity, as we established, is African. The genealogical argument for Jesus' connection to Africa is not a modern invention or an act of revisionist identity politics. It is built into the structure of the New Testament's own claims about who Jesus was and where he came from. What language did Jesus speak, and what does that tell us about his cultural context? Jesus spoke Aramaic as his primary language of daily life. Aramaic is a Semitic language closely related to Hebrew and to the Semitic languages of the ancient Near East, and its cultural roots lie in the same geographical corridor that connects the ancient Near East to Africa through the Fertile Crescent and the Red Sea trade routes. The Aramaic spoken in 1st century Galilee was the language of a population that had been shaped by centuries of contact with Egypt, Persia, Babylon, and the broader Near Eastern world. The specific Galilean Aramaic that Jesus spoke was distinctive enough that Peter's Galilean accent was recognizable to the people in the courtyard of the high priest during Jesus' trial. According to Matthew 26:73, Jesus was identifiable by his regional accent, meaning he had a specific, localized cultural and linguistic identity rooted in the Galilee region of 1st century Palestine. That region was not a culturally isolated bubble. It was a crossroads of trade and migration, where Phoenicians, Arabs, Cushites, Egyptians, and Greeks all had presence and all had contact with the local Jewish population. The cultural context of Jesus' language was diverse, connected, and deeply rooted in the African and Near Eastern world that surrounded it. The historical Jesus was not recognized as divine by the people who saw him in person on the street. This is a crucial point for the question of his appearance. If Jesus had looked strikingly different from the people around him, if he had had the luminous, pale, otherworldly appearance of the European paintings, he would have been recognizable at a distance in any crowd. But the gospel narratives repeatedly describe situations in which Jesus was not recognized, in which he blended into groups, in which even his disciples failed to identify him in certain contexts. Most strikingly, Judas had to identify Jesus to the soldiers who came to arrest him in the Garden of Gethsemane by kissing him, a prearranged signal specifically designed to distinguish Jesus from the other men present in the dark. If Jesus had looked like the European paintings, the soldiers would not have needed Judas to point him out. He could have been identified by his appearance alone. The need for a specific identifying signal in a small group of men in a garden at night implies that Jesus looked similar enough to his companions that identification required something more specific than simply looking at his face. He looked like his people. His people looked like the people of the ancient Near East. And the people of the ancient Near East in 1st century Galilee and Judea were dark-complexioned Semitic people with dark hair and dark features. The question of whether Jesus was African in a strict geographic sense is a different question from whether he had African ancestry, African connections, and African features. He was born in Bethlehem, which is in Judea, which is geographically in Asia in modern continental terms. He was raised in Nazareth, in Galilee. He ministered primarily in Galilee and Judea. He died in Jerusalem. He was not born in Africa in the geographic sense, but his life had African dimensions that are unavoidable and that the standard Western telling of his story systematically minimizes. He was a refugee in Africa during his earliest years. His genealogy includes African-adjacent women at multiple points. He descended from a people who spent 400 years in Africa and carried the genetic and cultural legacy of that African sojourn into their subsequent history. He spoke a language in a cultural context saturated with African contact and African trade. He was described physically in terms that map onto dark complexion and wool-textured hair. The early church that most fervently preserved his memory and his teaching was the African Church of Egypt and Ethiopia, which kept the closest physical proximity to the human Jesus, received the faith earliest, and maintained the longest continuous practice. To separate Jesus from Africa requires erasing multiple layers of his actual history. What do we know about ancient Galilee specifically, the region where Jesus grew up and conducted most of his ministry? Galilee in the 1st century was not a culturally or ethnically homogeneous Jewish enclave. It was a crossroads region that ancient Jewish texts referred to as Galil Hagoyim, Galilee of the nations, or Galilee of the Gentiles, precisely because of its diverse population and its history of settlement by multiple ethnic groups. The region had been settled, conquered, and repopulated multiple times across the centuries preceding Jesus' birth. When the Assyrians conquered the northern kingdom of Israel in 722 BC, they deported much of the Israelite population and resettled the region with peoples from Babylon, Cutha, Ava, Hamath, and Sepharvaim, according to 2 Kings 17. When Jews returned to Galilee in subsequent centuries, they were returning to a region that had been inhabited by a mixed population, and the resulting Galilean Jewish community was itself ethnically diverse, in ways that the more conservative Judean community to the south sometimes looked down on. The Judeans had a saying, rendered in John 1:46, "Can anything good come out of Nazareth?" The condescension in that question reflects the Judean attitude toward Galilean Jews as less pure, less rigorous, and less prestigious than their southern counterparts. The most significant theological figure in the history of Western civilization grew up in a region that was considered unsophisticated and ethnically mixed by the standards of his own people. He was not from the prestigious center. He was from the diverse, looked down on periphery. The genetic history of ancient Judeans and Israelites, as revealed by ancient Dina studies published in the last decade, confirms what the geographic and historical evidence suggests. Ancient Dina recovered from burials in the southern Levant shows a population with genetic ancestry from both the Fertile Crescent and from earlier populations of the region, including connections to ancient Egyptian populations. The Canaanites, whose territory the Israelites occupied after the Exodus, and with whom they repeatedly intermarried despite the prohibitions in the law, had their own genetic profile rooted in the ancient Near East and showing connections to Anatolian farmers and pre-pottery Neolithic populations of the region. The genetic profile of first-century Judeans would have been the accumulated result of thousands of years of population history, including the Egyptian sojourn, the Canaanite settlement, the Assyrian deportation and repopulation, the Babylonian exile, the Persian period return, and the Hellenistic period of Greek cultural influence. It was not a genetically isolated population. It was a genetically complex population with deep roots in the ancient Near Eastern and African adjacent world, whose phenotypic expression would have been consistently dark complexioned, dark-haired, and dark-eyed, as the forensic reconstruction and the historical descriptions uniformly suggest. What role did Africa play in early Christianity, and what does that tell us about the relationship between Jesus and Africa? We have established in previous videos in this series that the Ethiopian church was founded within decades of the crucifixion through the conversion of the Ethiopian eunuch in Acts 8. We have established that the Alexandrian Church of Egypt was founded according to tradition by Mark, the apostle, within a generation of Jesus' death. We have established that the greatest theologians of early Christianity, the men who defined the doctrine of the Trinity, the nature of Christ, the doctrine of grace, and the structure of Christian worship, were North African men from Egypt, Algeria, and Tunisia. The African church did not receive Christianity from Europe. The African church received Christianity directly from the first generation of witnesses and built the doctrinal and institutional structures that the European church then inherited. The proximity of the African church to the historical Jesus in both time and geography is closer than any European church. The people who were physically closest to Jesus, who preserved his memory with the most immediate fidelity, who built the theological framework within which his significance was understood, were African. And those African Christians, painting Jesus in their own tradition for centuries before the European painters arrived, consistently depicted him with African and Near Eastern features. The Coptic art tradition of Egypt, which predates the European Renaissance by over 1,000 years, shows Jesus with the dark complexion and dark features of the Egyptian population. The Ethiopian church, which has never been colonized by European Christianity in the way that other African churches were, maintains an artistic tradition of Jesus that shows him with Ethiopian features. These are not modern revisions or African nationalist reclamations of a European figure. These are older traditions, closer to the source, maintained by communities with the most direct historical claim to fidelity to the actual human being whose life they were depicting. Why does it matter what Jesus looked like? This is the question that people ask when they want to dismiss the entire inquiry as theological vanity or identity politics. And the question deserves a serious answer. It matters for the same reason that every decision about representation matters. And it matters more than most, because the question is about the single most depicted human being in the history of art. Jesus appears in more paintings, more sculptures, more stained glass windows, more illustrated books, more films, more murals, more icons, and more devotional objects than any other human being who has ever lived. The image of Jesus that most people carry has been placed in their minds at an early age, repeated across every form of visual media for their entire lives, and reinforced by the most powerful cultural institutions in the world. When that image is a pale European man, and when that pale European image of God incarnate has been displayed to billions of non-European people for 500 years as the authoritative face of the divine, the effects on how those people understand their own relationship to the sacred are not theoretical. They are measured. They are documented. They operate in the same psychological register that makes representation at every level of power important. If the face of God looks like your oppressor and not like you, the theology of human dignity that is supposed to underpin your faith operates at a disadvantage before you have read a single verse. Children who grow up seeing only European faces in the sacred stories of their tradition absorb a theological message that is never stated explicitly but lands with the force of doctrine. The holy looks like them, not like you. The stakes of the Jesus appearance question are not aesthetic. They are spiritual and psychological, and they have been causing measurable damage for 500 years. There is also the question of what the historical Jesus himself would have made of the image that has been attached to his name. Jesus, in the gospel narratives, consistently identified with the poor, the marginalized, the excluded, the people who were looked down on by the power structures of his world. The Sermon on the Mount is a manifesto for the people of the Roman Empire and the Jewish religious establishment had written off. Blessed are the poor. Blessed are those who mourn. Blessed are the meek. The entire arc of the gospel narrative places Jesus in solidarity with those who have the least, who are seen as the least, who are treated as the least by the systems of power surrounding them. The historical Jesus, a dark-complexioned Jewish man from the looked-down-on region of Galilee, would have been recognizable to every person who has ever been dismissed, underestimated, or excluded on the basis of their appearance, their origin, or their social position. The image that replaces him with a pale, luminous, idealized European figure does not just misrepresent his physical appearance. It misrepresents his social position, his cultural location, and the specific historical community in which he chose to be incarnate. If you believe the theology of incarnation, the doctrine that God chose to become a specific human being in a specific time and place and community, then the specific human being God chose was a dark-complexioned man from a stigmatized region, from a colonial subject population, from a family of artisan class workers, in a first-century Near Eastern community, with 400 years of African ancestry in its collective memory. That specificity is not incidental to the theology. That specificity is the theology, and it has been painted over. Let's take the Sermon on the Mount apart geographically for a moment, because it is one of the most studied passages in Christian scripture, and its geographic context is almost never examined in relation to the population Jesus was addressing. Jesus delivers the Sermon on the Mount in Galilee, on a hillside above the Sea of Galilee, to a crowd of his disciples and a larger crowd of people who had followed him from across the region. Matthew 4:24-25 describes those people as coming from Syria, from the Decapolis, from Jerusalem and Judea, and from beyond the Jordan. This is a regionally diverse crowd in a racially mixed region. The poor people Jesus is blessing, the meek people he says will inherit the earth. The mourners and the hungry and the merciful and the peacemakers are the people of first century Galilee and its surrounding regions. They were dark-complexioned Semitic and mixed Near Eastern people. When Jesus looked out at the crowd on that hillside and said, "Blessed are you who are poor," he was looking at dark faces. When he said the meek shall inherit the earth, his eyes were on dark-featured people. The entire moral vision of the Sermon on the Mount was delivered by a dark man to dark people in a dark corner of the Roman Empire, and the church painted it white. The question of Jesus' hair deserves specific attention because it is the detail that the European artistic tradition has most consistently gotten wrong, even by its own standards. Every European artistic depiction of Jesus shows him with long flowing hair. But the Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians 11:14 explicitly states that if a man has long hair, it is a disgrace to him. Paul is writing this to a church audience that includes people who knew Jesus personally or knew people who knew Jesus personally. And he is stating a principle about male hair length as though it is obvious and universally agreed upon. If Jesus had worn long flowing hair as a distinguishing feature of his appearance, Paul's statement would have been immediately recognizable as a contradiction of the example of the Lord. No one who has seen Jesus or talked to people who had seen him would have accepted a letter from Paul saying, "Long hair on a man is a disgrace," if Jesus was famous for wearing long hair. Paul's statement implies that the men in his audience, including the men who had known Jesus, understood short hair to be the normal and appropriate standard for men. Jesus almost certainly had short hair, not the flowing locks of the European paintings. The European paintings invented those locks specifically to evoke the Apollo imagery of classical Greek and Roman male idealized beauty, because the Renaissance artists who established the template were working within the conventions of classical aesthetics that treated flowing male hair as a marker of divine or heroic status. They applied the Apollo template to Jesus. The result is a Jesus who looks like the Greek god of the sun, the actual Jesus of Nazareth. According to the cultural norms of first century Galilee described by Paul, had short hair. Another detail, like the pale skin, that turns out to be a Renaissance artistic convention rather than historical fact. The vinegar sponge incident at the crucifixion is a small detail in the gospel narratives that has a geographic implication worth noting. John 19:29 describes soldiers filling a sponge with sour wine, putting it on a hyssop branch, and holding it to Jesus' mouth. The use of hyssop specifically is significant because hyssop was a plant associated in the Hebrew Bible with purification rituals and specifically with the Passover. But in this context, its significance is also geographic. Hyssop grows primarily in dry, rocky areas of the Mediterranean and Near East, but it was also a plant used in Egyptian medical and ritual contexts. The detail is small, but it is characteristic of the Gospel of John's tendency to include specific details that locate the crucifixion narrative in its actual geographic and cultural context. Why did the early church in Africa keep paintings of Jesus that look nothing like what you see in any Western church today? Why did the Ethiopian Orthodox Church the oldest continuously practicing Christian institution on earth, never once paint Jesus as a European man. Why, when the Coptic Christians of Egypt, who received Christianity within a generation of the crucifixion, and whose community was physically closest to the actual historical person, created their own artistic tradition of depicting him, did they produce images with dark skin, dark eyes, and African features? And why, when the Roman soldiers needed to arrest Jesus in a garden at night with a small group of his disciples, did they need a specific informant to physically point him out, rather than simply walking up to the most obviously non-Jewish looking man in the crowd? These questions have answers. The answers are in the archaeological record, in the art history, in the genetic science, and in the text of the Gospels themselves. None of them require a conspiracy theory. All of them require that you stop looking at the Warner Sallman painting from 1940 and start looking at the actual evidence. What did the Romans say about the Judeans they conquered and occupied? This matters because the Romans were meticulous record keepers and ethnographers who left detailed written descriptions of the peoples they encountered across the empire, and their descriptions of the Jewish population of first century Palestine are part of that record. Roman writers, including Tacitus and Josephus, writing within decades of Jesus' life and death, describe the Judeans in terms consistent with a dark complexion Near Eastern people. Tacitus in his histories, written around 05 AD, describes the origins of the Jewish people and refers to some traditions connecting them to Ethiopia. Josephus, the first century Jewish historian who wrote for a Roman audience, never once describes his people as pale or European featured, because a first century Jewish man describing his own people to a Roman audience had no reason to claim a physical appearance that his entire readership knew to be false. The Roman world's visual representation of conquered Judeans, as we noted in the Arch of Titus, shows dark-featured people. The Roman literary record describes a Near Eastern people. The Roman visual record shows a Near Eastern people. There is no primary source from the ancient world that describes the Judean population of the first century in terms that would fit the European image of Jesus. Not one. What was the cultural significance of Galilee specifically? And why does it matter that Jesus spent nearly his entire adult life there rather than in Jerusalem? Galilee was to first century Judaism what the Deep South was to early 20th century America, in the sense that it was a place looked down on by the cultural and religious establishment, but where the actual heartbeat of a people's life was lived. The religious establishment in Jerusalem considered Galileans religiously lax, ethnically mixed, and culturally inferior. The scribes and Pharisees who challenged Jesus repeatedly operated from a position of Jerusalem-based institutional authority, and their contempt for his Galilean origins is visible in multiple gospel passages. John 7:52 has the Pharisees dismissing Jesus by saying, "Are you from Galilee too? Search and you will see that no prophet arises from Galilee." They were using his regional origin as a dismissal. The people Jesus chose as his closest disciples, the 12 apostles, were predominantly Galilean. Fishermen from the Sea of Galilee, tax collectors from Galilean towns, workers from a mixed, diverse, looked down on region that the Jerusalem establishment had written off. Jesus was not the product of the prestigious center. He deliberately worked from the margins, and the margins of first century Judea were inhabited by dark-complexioned people who had been mixed with Assyrian resettlers, Phoenician traders, Arabian merchants, and travelers from the African corridor for centuries. Why did Herod want to kill Jesus? And what does that tell us about the world Jesus was born into? Matthew chapter 2 records that when Herod learned from the Magi that a king of the Jews had been born, he ordered the massacre of all male children in Bethlehem, aged 2 and under. This event, called the Massacre of the Innocents, drove the Holy Family into exile in Africa. But the political context behind it reveals something important about the world Jesus entered. Herod the Great was himself a man of mixed origin, an Idumean whose family had converted to Judaism and who ruled Judea as a client king of Rome. His anxiety about a rival king of the Jews was the anxiety of a politically insecure man in an occupied country under Roman domination. The world Jesus was born into was a colonized world. Judea was a Roman province. Its people were a subject population under military occupation. The taxes they paid went to Rome. The ultimate authority over their lives, including the authority to execute them, rested with Roman governors. Jesus was born into a colonized people under imperial occupation in a client kingdom ruled by a brutal and insecure king in a region that Rome treated as a resource to be managed rather than a civilization to be respected. The specificity of that political situation matters because it means Jesus was not born into privilege. He was born into occupation. He was born into the experience of being a subject people in someone else's empire. He was born into the specific social position of a member of a colonized group, and his entire ministry was conducted among that colonized group, from inside it, not from above it. What does the word Emmanuel actually mean, and why did Matthew choose it? Matthew chapter 1 verse 23 quotes Isaiah 7:14 in saying that the child to be born will be called Emmanuel, which means God with us. The theological point is that Jesus represents divine presence within the human condition rather than divine presence above or apart from it. God with us in the specific community, in the specific body, in the specific historical situation, with all of its specificity. A dark-complexioned man in first century Galilee under Roman occupation, born in a stable, raised as a craftsman's son, spending his adult life among fishermen, farmers, tax collectors, prostitutes, lepers, and the possessed. The Emmanuel theology is a theology of divine identification with the human condition in all its concrete specificity. And the specific human condition in which God chose to identify was not the condition of a Roman citizen, not the condition of a wealthy Judean priest, not the condition of an idealized European aristocrat. It was the condition of a dark-complexioned colonial subject from the most looked-down-on region of a colonized land. That choice, if you take the incarnation theology seriously, is the most radical statement of solidarity in human history. God chose not to enter the powerful, the prestigious, the racially constructed ideal. God chose the margin. God chose Galilee. God chose dark skin. And then the church spent 1,500 years painting it over with the face of the empire. Why do so many scholars now argue that Jesus looked more like a modern-day Palestinian Arab or North African man than the European figure in the paintings? The answer is straightforward genetics. Modern populations in the region that was first century Judea and Galilee. Meaning, modern Palestinians, modern Israeli Arabs, modern Jordanians, and to some extent modern Egyptian and North African people carry the genetic legacy of the ancient populations of that region. While the population has changed considerably over 2,000 years of conquest, migration, and admixture, the genetic continuity between ancient Levantine populations and modern populations of the same region has been confirmed by ancient Gnostic studies. The modern Palestinian Arab or Lebanese Christian who looks at the forensic reconstruction of a first century Galilean man and sees something like their own reflection is reacting to a genuine genetic and phenotypic continuity. The Jesus who would have been recognized by his contemporaries looked like the people of the modern Levant, not like the people of modern Northern Europe. This is what every forensic anthropologist who has studied the question concludes. It is what every historian of the ancient Near East who has studied the population of first century Galilee concludes. It is what the ancient Dana studies confirm about the genetic population of ancient Judea, and it is what the revelation description of bronze skin and wool-textured hair confirms through direct biblical testimony. What happened to the images of Jesus that predate the European artistic tradition? This is a question that gets at the archaeology of Christian art in a way that most church members have never been invited to explore. The oldest surviving images of Jesus are found in the Christian catacombs of Rome, underground burial chambers used by the early Roman Christian community in the 2nd and 3rd centuries. These images, produced within 1 to 2 centuries of the historical Jesus, show a figure that is clearly drawn in the artistic conventions of the ancient Mediterranean world rather than the European Renaissance world. The beardless, short-haired, youthful Jesus of the earliest catacomb art does not resemble the long-haired, bearded European figure of later tradition. The skin tone in fresco painting is limited by the medium's color conventions, but the facial features and hair are consistently drawn in the Mediterranean Near Eastern style. Early Syrian Christian art, produced in communities with direct geographical and historical proximity to the land where Jesus lived, shows Jesus with the Semitic features of the Syrian population. The Dura Europos church paintings from the 3rd century in modern Syria, some of the oldest surviving Christian paintings in the world, depict Jesus and the biblical figures with the dark features of the Near Eastern people who painted them. The European Jesus did not emerge fully formed from the historical record. It was constructed gradually through a process of artistic revision that accelerated dramatically during the Renaissance and reached its definitive modern form in the 20th century with the Solomon painting. Before that construction process, the Christian artistic tradition showed a Jesus who looked like the people of the ancient Near East and Africa. What does the Gospel of Mark, widely considered the earliest gospel written, tell us about how Jesus was perceived by the people around him? Mark's gospel is notable for its urgency, its immediacy, and its lack of editorial theological interpretation compared to Matthew, Luke, and John. Mark simply shows you what happened, and what happened in Mark is that Jesus was consistently underestimated, dismissed, and challenged by the authorities, not because of his appearance, but because of his message and his authority. But the people who underestimated him did so in ways that presupposed he looked ordinary, unremarkable, like everybody else. In Mark chapter 6, when Jesus returns to Nazareth and teaches in the synagogue, the people's reaction is not this the carpenter, the son of Mary, and brother of James and Joseph, and Judas and Simon? And are not his sisters here with us? And they took offense at him. They knew his family. They had watched him grow up. He was recognizable as the carpenter's son, as the brother of specific named individuals in the community. He looked like a man from Nazareth because he was a man from Nazareth. He had not been transformed by some visible divine mark into an otherworldly figure distinct from the people around him. He was one of them. He looked like them. And that ordinariness was part of what made him difficult for his contemporaries to accept. The people of Nazareth stumbled over the fact that the son of Joseph could be the one he claimed to be. Their stumbling presupposes that he looked like Joseph's son. Joseph was a carpenter from Galilee. His son would have looked like a carpenter from Galilee. Carpenters from 1st century Galilee looked like dark-complexioned Near Eastern workingmen. Why is the question of Jesus' identity so politically charged? And why has so much institutional energy been invested in maintaining the European image? The answer connects to the same political history we have traced in every video in this series. The transatlantic slave trade, the colonization of Africa, the establishment of racial hierarchy as the foundational organizational principle of European imperial civilization, all of these projects were conducted under the banner of Christianity. The cross went before or alongside the gun and the chain in every theater of European expansion. The missions followed the trading companies or came first to prepare the psychological ground. For these projects to function spiritually and psychologically, for the European populations that participated in them, the God those populations worshipped needed to look like them. A God who looked like the people being enslaved would create an unbearable cognitive dissonance for the people doing the enslaving. So the image had to be managed. The European Jesus was not just an artistic preference. It was an institutional requirement for the theology of racial hierarchy to function without internal contradiction. You cannot tell people that the most fully human expression of the divine looks like a dark African man and then proceed to treat dark African men as subhuman. The two propositions cannot coexist without destroying one another. So the institutional church, operating in the context of European imperial expansion from the 15th century onward, chose to preserve the racial hierarchy and manage the image of Jesus accordingly. The 500 years of European Jesus paintings are not a neutral artistic tradition. They are a sustained institutional project of theological propaganda whose purpose was to make the face of the divine legible as European, and therefore to make European expansion in the name of that divine feel like the natural order of things. What would it mean for the theology of incarnation if Jesus were recognized as a dark-complexioned man from a colonized Near Eastern people? The theology of incarnation, the central Christian doctrine that God became fully human in the specific person of Jesus of Nazareth, is the most radical claim in the entire Abrahamic tradition. It says that the infinite, eternal, transcendent creator of the universe chose to take on finite, mortal, specific human existence in all its particularity. Not humanity in the abstract, not an idealized human form, a specific body, a specific mother, a specific community, a specific language, a specific social class, a specific political situation. The specificity is the point. If the specificity is the point, then the specificity of Jesus' dark complexion, his Galilean accent, his artisan class family, his colonial subject status, his Near Eastern cultural context, all of it is theologically significant. It is the divine expressing its solidarity with a particular community of people in particular circumstances. The incarnation theology says that God looked like a dark-complexioned man from a colonized Near Eastern people, because that is what God chose to look like when God chose to be embodied. That choice is not an accident or an incidental detail. It is a statement. And every time the church paints it over with a European face, it is editing the statement God made in choosing the specificity of that body. What does the resurrection body of Jesus look like, according to the New Testament accounts? And what does that tell us about the continuity between his earthly body and his risen body? The resurrection appearances in the Gospels and Acts are striking precisely because of their combination of recognition and strangeness. Mary Magdalene does not recognize the risen Jesus at first, thinking he is the gardener, until he speaks her name. The disciples on the road to Emmaus walk with the risen Jesus for hours without recognizing him only in the breaking of bread. The disciples fishing on the Sea of Galilee do not initially recognize the figure on the shore calling to them. And yet in all these accounts, the risen Jesus is recognizably continuous with the pre-resurrection Jesus once the recognition happens. He shows Thomas the wounds in his hands and side. He eats fish with the disciples. He is not a ghost or a pure spiritual form, but a bodily presence that can be touched and that needs to eat. The resurrection body in the New Testament is a transformation of the earthly body, not a replacement of it. It is the same body, transfigured, which means the description in Revelation chapter 1, the bronze skin and the wool-like hair, is the transfigured version of the earthly body. The risen and glorified Jesus, in John's vision on Patmos, retains the physical characteristics of the Galilean man he was. Bronze skin, wool hair. These are the features of the body God chose, carried into resurrection, carried into eternity, carried into the most magnificent vision of divine glory in the entire New Testament. The glorified Jesus looks like a dark man. John saw him and wrote it down. And then the church painted something else. Why do scholars like Joan Taylor of King's College London argue that Jesus was likely short, with a weathered complexion from outdoor labor? And how does this challenge both the European artistic tradition and the more romanticized African reclamations of his image? Taylor, whose 2018 book, What Did Jesus Look Like?, is one of the most thorough academic treatments of the question, argues that Jesus probably looked quite ordinary by the standards of his time and place. Her analysis draws on Isaiah 53, the Shroud of Turin's contested evidence, forensic anthropological data, and the social context of first century Galilee to argue that Jesus was probably around 5 feet, 5 inches tall, had dark olive to brown skin, dark short hair, possibly with a beard, and the kind of weathered, sun-darkened appearance that a man doing outdoor work in the Galilean sun would develop over decades. She argues against both the ethereal European Jesus and against some of the more specific African reclamations of his image. Her conclusion, widely shared among biblical scholars and historians, is simply that Jesus looked like a typical first century Galilean man, and that typical first century Galilean man was dark, compact, ordinary looking, and completely unlike every major artistic representation that has ever been attached to his name. The academic consensus is not a debate between European Jesus and African Jesus. The academic consensus is that both the European and the romanticized versions are wrong, and the actual historical figure was a dark-complexioned, ordinary-looking Near Eastern man who would be stopped by SA at every American airport if he tried to board a plane today dressed in first-century clothing. What do the Dead Sea Scrolls tell us about the religious and intellectual context of Jesus' life? And how does that context connect to Africa? The Dead Sea Scrolls, discovered between 1947 and 1956 in the caves near Qumran on the northwestern shore of the Dead Sea, are the oldest known manuscripts of the Hebrew Bible and include texts from Jewish sects active in the century before and during Jesus' lifetime. The community that produced and preserved these scrolls, widely identified with the Essenes, was a Jewish sect practicing ritual purity, communal ownership, and intense scriptural study in the desert near the Dead Sea. Jesus' ministry began after his baptism by John the Baptist, and John the Baptist operated in the wilderness of Judea near the Jordan River, in the same geographic region as the Qumran community, with enough thematic overlap in his message that many scholars have debated whether John was himself an Essene or was influenced by Essene practice. The Essene community's scrolls include extensive engagement with Ethiopian Jewish themes, with the Book of Enoch, which is canonical in the Ethiopian Bible, and with the broader Kushite and African dimensions of Israelite religious history that we discussed in the Ethiopian Bible video in this series. The religious context of Jesus' immediate predecessor and the community that shaped the landscape of first century Jewish religious life was not hermetically sealed from the African theological tradition. It was engaging directly with texts and traditions whose African connections were multiple and explicit. Why is it significant that the first recorded person to proclaim Jesus as the Son of God after his death in Mark's Gospel was a Roman centurion? Mark 15:39 records that when the centurion standing opposite Jesus saw how he died, he said, "Truly, this man was the Son of God." The Roman centurion, the representative of the occupying power, the soldier of empire, the man whose presence at the execution was a symbol of Roman dominance over the subject Judean population. This man, of all people, was the first in Mark's narrative to make the central Christian confession. And Roman centurions in first century Judea were not all Italian men. The Roman auxiliary forces that served in Judea included soldiers recruited from across the empire, including North Africa. A Roman centurion in 1st century Judea could have been African. He could have been a dark-complexioned man from any of the dozens of ethnic groups that Rome recruited into its military apparatus. The detail is Mark's way of saying that the recognition of Jesus crosses every boundary of empire. But it is also a detail that places the central Christian confession in the mouth of a man who was definitively not from the Jewish community. The first person outside the Jewish community to recognize who Jesus was may well have been an African man in Roman uniform. The Gospels have been full of these African presences, from Simon of Cyrene carrying the cross to the Ethiopian eunuch in Acts going home to Africa with the gospel, from the wise men coming from the direction of Africa to the Holy Family sheltered in Africa. The presence of Africa in the Jesus story is not a modern insertion. It is woven through the narrative from the beginning. What does the Gnostic tradition preserve about the physical appearance of Jesus, and why has that tradition been suppressed? The Gnostic Gospels, the collection of texts discovered at Nag Hammadi in Egypt in 1945, include multiple accounts of Jesus that were excluded from the canonical New Testament when the church's hierarchy settled the canon in the 4th century. These texts, including the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip, the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, and others, present a Jesus whose theological significance is expressed through his teachings about inner knowledge and spiritual transformation, rather than through his physical appearance or his death and resurrection. Interestingly, several Gnostic texts explicitly describe Jesus as being able to change his appearance, to be seen differently by different people, or to appear in forms that do not correspond to a fixed physical description. The Gospel of John already contains traces of this theme in its resurrection appearance accounts where Jesus is not immediately recognized. The Gnostic elaboration of this theme is theologically motivated, but it has an interesting implication for the question of Jesus' appearance. The tradition that was closest to the earliest Christian communities in Egypt, the Gnostic tradition that flourished particularly in the African Church of Alexandria, was not invested in fixing Jesus' appearance in the European mold. It was more interested in the nature of his wisdom and his spiritual significance than in the color of his skin. The tradition that did fix his appearance as European was the Roman aligned tradition that eventually became the Catholic Church, and it did so for reasons that had more to do with the politics of imperial legitimacy than with historical accuracy. Why do some historians argue that the question of Jesus' race is anachronistic? And why does that argument ultimately fail to resolve the issue? The argument from anachronism goes like this. The racial categories we use today, black, white, African, European, did not exist in the 1st century in the same form. So asking whether Jesus was black or white is imposing modern categories on an ancient world that organized identity differently. This argument is correct as far as it goes. 1st century Judeans did not think of themselves in the racial categories that were constructed in the 15th through 19th centuries as tools of colonial ideology. They thought of themselves in terms of ethnicity, religion, tribal affiliation, and regional identity. They were Judeans, Galileans, Israelites, sons of the house of David. These are not the same categories as modern racial classifications. But the argument from anachronism fails for a specific reason. The European image of Jesus is equally anachronistic. The European artistic tradition imposed 15th through 20th century European racial categories onto a 1st century Near Eastern man, just as much as the African reclamation tradition imposes modern racial categories onto the same man. The anachronism argument does not resolve in favor of the European image. It resolves in favor of removing all modern racial impositions and returning to the historical evidence for what a 1st century Galilean man looked like. And that evidence, as we have established through forensic anthropology, genetics, ancient Gnos studies, and biblical description, produces a dark-complexioned man with the physical features of the ancient Near East. The anachronism argument, honestly applied, destroys the European Jesus more thoroughly than it challenges the African reclamation. Because the African reclamation at least points in the direction that the historical and genetic evidence actually points. What is the connection between Jesus and Moses? And why does it matter for the question of his physical and cultural identity? The Gospel of Matthew is structured deliberately to present Jesus as a new Moses. The parallels are systematic. Moses was hidden from a murderous king as an infant. Jesus was hidden from Herod. Moses came out of Egypt. Jesus came out of Egypt. Moses gave the law from a mountain. Jesus gave the Sermon on the Mount from a mountain. Moses performed 10 signs, the plagues. Jesus performed 10 miracles in Matthew's account. Moses fed Israel with manna in the wilderness. Jesus fed 5,000 with bread in the wilderness. Matthew is telling his Jewish audience that Jesus is the fulfillment of the Moses story. Now, we established in the Moses video in this series that Moses was raised in an African palace, educated in African learning, married an African woman, and encountered God for the first time on African soil. The Moses figure, whose story Matthew is using as the template for Jesus' life, is a man with deep African connections. The typological connection Matthew draws between Moses and Jesus is not just theological. It is a connection between two men whose lives were both marked by African geography, African shelter, African education, and African experience. Moses in Egypt. Jesus in Egypt. Moses educated in the palace. Jesus sheltered by the same African land. The Moses-Jesus typology that Matthew builds into the structure of his gospel places both figures in a narrative whose African dimension is not incidental, but structurally essential. What would Jesus have eaten, and how does the food culture of first century Galilee connect to the broader African and Near Eastern world? The question of food might seem trivial compared to the weightier theological questions, but food is culture, and culture is identity, and the dietary culture of first century Galilee was a Near Eastern culture with African connections. That makes the European image of Jesus even more incongruous. Jesus and his disciples ate bread, fish from the Sea of Galilee, olives and olive oil, figs, dates, pomegranates, lentils, chickpeas, and a variety of vegetables. They drank wine. The Passover meal that Jesus shared with his disciples the night before his death, which Christians commemorate as the Last Supper, included unleavened bread and wine in a ritual form that the Hebrew tradition had developed during and after the Egyptian sojourn. The bitter herbs of the Passover meal were a memorial of Egyptian slavery. The unleavened bread was a memorial of the haste of the Exodus. Every time Jesus participated in the Passover, he was participating in a ritual memorial of Africa, a cultural practice whose meaning was defined by the experience of a people who had lived in Africa for 400 years and whose collective identity was shaped by their African experience more than by any other single historical event. The food culture, the ritual culture, the religious culture of first century Judaism were saturated with African memory. Jesus lived inside that culture. He was formed by it. He ate at its table and drank from its cup and participated in its memories. What do the earliest Ethiopian and Coptic images of Jesus tell us that the European tradition suppressed? In the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, whose founding we trace to the conversion of the Ethiopian eunuch in Acts 8, and whose continuous practice makes it the oldest Christian institution with the closest living connection to the world of the New Testament, Jesus has always been depicted with the features of an Ethiopian man. Dark skin, dark eyes, African facial structure, dressed in the robes of Ethiopian royalty. The Lalibela rock churches of Ethiopia, carved from solid volcanic rock in the 12th century, but housing artistic traditions of much greater antiquity, contain images of Jesus that would be unrecognizable to anyone whose only exposure to Christian art has been the European tradition. They show a Jesus who looks like the people who painted him, because the Ethiopian Christians who painted him understood that the incarnation meant God becoming a specific human being in a specific community. And they naturally depicted that human being in terms of the human community closest to their own experience and tradition. The Coptic Church of Egypt, which traces its founding to Mark the Apostle in the 1st century, maintains an artistic tradition that is similarly distinct from the European. Coptic images of Jesus and the saints show Mediterranean and North African features, darker complexion, Semitic structure, the phenotypic range of the populations of Northeast Africa and the ancient Near East. These traditions are not revisionist. They are older than the European tradition. They predate Raphael by 1,000 years. They predate the Renaissance by 800 years. They represent the living memory of Christian communities that received the faith from the first generation of witnesses and that have never needed to be told that Jesus looked like a European, because they knew he did not. Why does the question of Jesus' appearance matter for the 21st century global church? And what changes when the historical reality is acknowledged? The global church of the 21st century is majority non-European for the first time since the early centuries of Christianity. The largest Christian populations in the world are in sub-Saharan Africa, in Latin America, and in Asia, with the African church growing at a rate that will make it the dominant demographic force in global Christianity within a generation. For the first time in 500 years, the people setting the theological and moral agenda of global Christianity are not European people painting European faces on the holy. They are African, Latin American, and Asian Christians who are in the process of reclaiming the pre-European iconographic traditions of their own communities and discovering in those traditions a Jesus who looks far more like their neighbors than like anyone in a Renaissance painting. The decolonization of Christian art is happening in real time in churches across Africa and Asia and the Pacific, and it is not an act of cultural appropriation or politically motivated revision. It is a return to the African and Asian artistic traditions that predate the European artistic tradition by centuries. A return to a Jesus who looks like the people of the land where he lived. A return to the bronze-colored, wool-haired figure that John of Patmos described in the 1st century before anyone had thought to repaint him. Here is where all of it lands, and it is not a small place. Was Jesus African? The precise answer is that he was a 1st century Near Eastern man whose life had African dimensions that are impossible to remove from his story without fundamentally misrepresenting it. He was born to a people with 400 years of African ancestry and African formation in their collective memory. He spent his first years of life as a refugee on African soil. His physical description in the New Testament describes features that are consistent with dark complexion Near Eastern and African adjacent populations, and inconsistent with pale European populations. His genealogy includes women with African connections at multiple points. The tradition that received and preserved his memory with the most immediate historical fidelity was the African Church of Egypt and Ethiopia, which depicted him with African and Near Eastern features. The genetic population he belonged to was a dark-complexioned Semitic people whose physical appearance has been confirmed by forensic anthropology, ancient Dina studies, and the visual record of Roman-era art. The image that dominates global Christian consciousness was produced by European painters 14 to 20 centuries after his death, for political and institutional reasons that had everything to do with the project of European imperial expansion and nothing to do with historical accuracy. The question is not whether Jesus was technically African in the geographic birthplace sense. The question is why everything that connects him to Africa has been systematically removed from the story the church tells about him. And who benefits from that removal? and whether the 2 billion Christians alive today are finally ready to put those connections back where they belong and look honestly at the man who, by the testimony of his own scripture, had bronze skin and wool-textured hair and spent his earliest years sheltered by the African continent that the church then spent 500 years pretending he had nothing to do with.